And in my day job, I work at a company called Content and Cloud, Microsoft partner in the UK. And we have a bit of a SharePoint background, bit of a UC Teams background as well. And we do a lot of tenant-to-tenant migrations at the moment as well. But one thing that I was going to talk a lot about in this session, and then I noticed that fellow MVP Paul Robershaw and Mike Weaver, they're talking about tenant migrations at the same time today. So rather than us do basically the same session at the same time, then if you catch up on that, then you'll find basically the same advice, because I did a webinar with them last week doing a similar sort of coverage. So going to focus a bit more on the files side of stuff, moving from on-premises, rather than purely tenant-to-tenant migrations, or having a balance between the two in this session. So just so you know what you're getting. But if you've got any questions about that as we go through, we can go into that as we go. At the back, you'll see Jason Wynn, who I do the All About 365 podcast with. I will remind you to subscribe to that. You can get it on iTunes, Spotify, and everywhere else. And Paul Robershaw, myself, do the Practical 365 podcast as well. So check out that for some videos that we did out on the track yesterday, where we tried to use Teams walkie-talkie mode, which went better than we thought, actually. I didn't think it worked very well in a car, and of course, don't try that at home either, because don't think it's quite legal on a road. But Teams data migrations, you know, why would you want to do this? A lot of people have moved to Teams, or just adopted it as they went along, and have used it for meetings, chat. But really, the whole Microsoft 365 piece, you know, Teams is sitting above this, and it's bringing together all of the best things in Microsoft 365 into one place. So bringing in your data so people can find it and use it in Teams makes it just better for everybody to use it, because when we talk through user research and listen to the things people want, then over the years they've been asking for one place where they can get access to everything on a project, or a manager wants to be able to understand what everybody's doing. So having disconnected experiences, that's just not what Teams is about. It is about bringing those things together. So we'll talk about the why, you know, why that comes into things. And also, what about bringing in third-party data as well? So if we need to bring in other chat data from other systems, you know, what are the sort of limitations with some of the newest beta APIs that are out there that vendors are building tools to use with? And then if we're going to actually start doing this, you know, what are the basics that you need to know? Because most of us are not long-term SharePoint experts who've been doing this for 20 years. Some folks absolutely have, and leveraging some of their experience as a starting point helps other people who are coming at this as perhaps UC experts into teams who are now doing things like file migrations, or infrastructure folks who have done a lot of on-premises work and are transitioning those skills across. They need to perhaps adopt even just a little bit of those SharePoint skills that sit under the hood to get things right. And in terms of the tools for Microsoft you can use to migrate, I see a migration with t-shirt there. Probably actually it's more Quest and the others where they've got all these tools that they sell for moving on-premises stuff in. You probably don't need many vendors' tools to do these migrations. It is when it comes to third-party systems, tenant migrations, that these really come into play. But you can do an awful lot with the Microsoft tooling. So a lot of the time, expensive file migrations are a lot cheaper than you think. You've got everything you need in the box. And I'll show you how that works. So going back to that initial question, you know, why? Well, there's the technology-driven goal, right? You know, we might want to replace older systems. Customers I'm working with at the moment, some of these reasons are possibly common reasons you've had yourself. Like they have an old EMC Isilon that's it's going out of support. They want to get stuff off it, or they've got old file servers dotted around. They want to get rid of this. Moving to a zero trust model where they don't want people to come in to using a VPN and access files in a traditional way. But then there's the business side of that, where there's the stuff that comes out of the user research, the way that they want people to work, co-authoring on documents together, comments that I will have from customers when we've done workshops, are things like, we want to be able to produce reports very, very quickly. We want to be able to work together as a team and be able to work on things. And then, you know, if we could deliver a report in an hour, rather than what's taking us at the moment, several days of back and forth over email, then that'd be a massive win for us. And when you talk to users, when you talk to the people in the business, those are the things that help provide that supporting evidence above the whole digital transformation goal, or whatever these loosely defined things are that people come up with to hang their business-driven project with, where they've been promised all these savings, but then at the end won't be able to evaluate whether or not it was a success. So having these goals in mind before you start just doing it, is really, really important, because without that, how are you going to know that it was a success? But it is more than just files. There's other things that we need to bring across as well. And Microsoft 365 groups are really the sort of the key to everything. So before Teams came along, what we would see with customers is there was something that Microsoft 365 groups, or Office 365 groups as it was called at the time, sort of sparked in people's minds, where if they were using multiple tools, then groups, the way that it worked, tied everything together. So if they were using perhaps Google Drive and they were using Slack, or they were using another tool, and all of the information that a team needed was dotted across multiple vendors' tools, then it answered one of these what tool to use when questions that often came up with Office 365, where, well, sure, I can use Office 365, but it doesn't really help me because, well, they're still all in different places. I've still got SharePoint, I've still got Exchange, I've still got all these different services. And groups as a wrapper to sort of tie that life cycle of data and people who access it together, sort of a bit of a glue to be able to help make that work. And then Teams on top of that absolutely gives a much better reason. It's more understandable to people who are going in and using it. So that group aspect, all of those group connected services, they can be places where your data is going to go into as you come from other services. So if they're using Trello, or they're using an equivalent to Power BI and bringing things across into that as well, then you've got a place where perhaps not all of the data necessarily is going to come across as part of moving to use those apps, but the supporting data, the files they use, and then enablement of those services as well. And then we've got all the other integrations. So a key thing that you might see when you're starting to use Teams is not bringing the data in, but you're going to get access to that data through bringing in integrations. So one common way of making this work easily that I've seen talking to people who work a lot with first-line workers. If you haven't seen him online, there's Noppanen, does a lot with first-line workers. He comes from an engineering background, and one really key learning I got from him when Jason and I did a podcast with him at Ignite a few years ago was bring in an app that first-line workers have to use. The data might still be in its source, but they can't get to it unless they're using Teams. So bringing access to that data, it's a lot easier than trying to migrate it in and build a whole new app. And you've got a sticky reason for using that team, for people coming into it to see all of that stuff. Now, one thing that is not to do with the tenant migrations, as I say, other sessions on that, vendors talking about that as well, is newer capabilities that are going to make it easier to bring in other platforms. When I put forward this session, I thought, well, several vendors are coming up with Slack migration solutions, and we had a few opportunities at Content and Cloud for Slack data migrations, moving in chat data, moving in all of the stuff across to the side. But the reality seems to be that people talk about it, they like the idea of it, but it doesn't happen a lot. So most of these tools from vendors at the moment, they're using these beta APIs from Microsoft. And the beta APIs for moving chat data into Teams are better than the existing ones because they allow for better data fidelity. So all of the migration vendors are using the production ones today, where it's due to Microsoft's limitations. It's not very good if you're bringing chat data in. Has anyone done a Teams chat data migration? Yeah, a couple of nodding heads. Is it? I won't ask the vendor. But did it blow? Was it world changing? No.
cause more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, and that's Microsoft's fault. It's not the vendor's fault, because all these other technologies like SharePoint and Exchange, but you can move data in and you can set what date it came to, or the file creation date, when it gets to the side, all of the things that you can do in Exchange. Why can't you do those when you bring data across into Teams? And it's really that product group view that they have where they've got these different ideas. Let's hope they're not listening or watch this back. But I think it's a really bad difference where you should be able to look at Microsoft and what they do, and they should have a common theme across the board. Where if you can move, your archive in to email from 20 years ago, and it looked like it was 20-year-old data, then why can't you move chats in? But their view seems to be, well, what if somebody changes that chat data while they migrated across? Well, that's the same with everything else. So why is it a problem now? But they've relented a little bit. So there's a beta API that's available at the moment. And I imagine all of the vendors at the moment have a beta version of that or are developing against it. And that gives some other opportunities for things like Slack. Because if you're coming from a competing tool, then you've not only got the fact that people want access to the stuff they already had. So Teams to Teams chat and channel data migration. Well, if it looks like somebody badly copy and pasted it across and posted it in as a system account and the dates are all wrong, but it's sort of there, then that's all right. But just before lockdown, I went to see a customer and we just won a project with them. And I won't mention the name. It's a well-known insurance broker website. And we're quite excited about this. We're going to excite everyone with a big adoption project, get all happy clappy and tell everybody about how brilliant Teams was. We'll be there probably wearing Teams t-shirts. Oh, and then second meeting, we'll doing the hand sanitizer, and then nothing after that. They rolled out Teams in part, but they didn't do any of the adoption stuff. But the one thing that stuck in my mind, though, that they said about the Slack part was they said a lot of the people are using Slack, and they said those people have threatened to leave if they move to Teams. They would have people who would quit their job over a chat app, and people were serious about that. And if you've seen how the job market is in our area at the moment, people can quit a job and get a new job very, very quickly in Microsoft 365. So perhaps it's true, but it's a little bit over the top. But then again, if somebody said to me, right, Steve, Content Cloud are going to move to Slack, I'd be like, this isn't the kind of place I want to work, because I'm kind of a Teams person. So maybe, but that does mean that the equivalent of a beta or GA data migration for chat would be pretty terrible. And the equivalence to Slack functionality has been a massively long journey where, when I'm working with Microsoft, might look at Slack and what people do in it and can see a one-to-one equivalence of what should be where. And we could see some flaws in this where there wasn't a direct one-to-one mapping, because you've got a workspace and then you've got channels. So you've got a different structure to start with. But people are very attached to the way that their workspace works and use it in ways that have some crossover with tools like Yammer as well. A workspace where lots of things are open, some things are closed, almost like a team with lots and lots of channels, but some are private channels. And an organization, another financial services organization, very attached to Slack. And usually people who've got a Slack sticker and a Yammer sticker, they love Yammer as well. It happens. Really strange meeting. Like, you guys hate Teams. You love Yammer. Has anyone ever had that before? No. It says something about the people doing the adoption, right? They've done a really good job of getting that right. And that was us and them. But the person who did it has left now. So, but the challenge is, of course, people have really invested in what they've done in Slack. They've built integrations themselves into Slack. They've got, their CTO of a particular business unit it loves Slack. Is absolutely obsessed with the thing, and they've really got all of their processes working inside it. So getting these people to come across to the side and it's not perfect is just a no-go. It's a non-starter. So tools that can do this well are essential, but often it's a very long uphill journey. And actually, what organizations slowly find is probably going to be a better approach is not just to move across and go cut over, from this date, you no longer use this workspace anymore, but to let them slowly adopt it and actually build out a better way of working and say this is different rather than we've tried to make it the same and brought everything across. But the tools on the market, this is an example of one vendor, of what they can do at the moment. All the vendors that I'm aware of can do this. So Quest, AvaPoint, Migration Wiz, I'm sure at some point may or may not do Slack migrations. But what they're telling me is they're not getting anybody actually doing it because people are interested and then it just dies. But we can do that if you ever have to. But it's, again, it's got less limitations than a Teams traditional chat migration, but it's still got some limitations. The good thing about those beta APIs, and because all these tools are beta at the moment, you enroll in a preview for it, is that it comes across with the original author. It's proper mappings. It's like a proper migration, but it's a one-time thing because of the beta API designs. You can't keep remigrating or have coexistence as you move across. There's a day everybody's going to move across from that workspace. So probably won't ever happen for you, but you need to be aware of those tools in case it does. Your biggest challenge won't necessarily be the tools. It will be the way people work with it and the destination structure to build out. So the file part is really the thing that I see people have always, over the last 10 years of Office 365, went through different ways of doing this and different levels of being able to move things across based around people's experience from doing this several times before and the maturity of SharePoint Online and OneDrive as a destination. Because a lot of organizations who are thinking about moving files to using Teams in SharePoint and OneDrive, then if they're assessing the market, then they've got a range of options. And you've probably heard best of breed, said it's either your customer saying it or your organization saying it, and they might look at tools where it might be more expensive to buy the cloud-based cloud storage box, whatever, but the transition might be more seamless. You don't have to change the way that you work to use it because you're just dumping your file shares. Ignite, if you've heard of that, with an E rather than an I, being one of these tools where it's not transformational. Company we bought or merged with, they loved selling it to customers because it was just like a file share in the cloud. So it's simpler. And when we're thinking about SharePoint, OneDrive today, we do need to think about making things better on the other side. We can't just lift and shift. And people's mindset is, I've got a set of tools where I can lift and shift. Some of these have even got co-authoring, Office integrations, Teams integrations. And then I've got a tool where my carrot at the end of the project is deep integration with the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And when I've worked with larger enterprises who are really looking at this, government departments who are looking at this, and they're evaluating the cost of the tools. We've already bought this one, but it's going to cost, because we've got Office 365, but it's going to cost us more to do and more time and effort, and there'll be more business change. Or we could buy a more expensive tool, but it'll be a simpler change for the users. Then the carrot at the end is this, it is the integration, everything working well together. Is it going to be worth going on that journey? So when you get there, then you've got the vision that was probably sold at the beginning of this project, where it is a single integrated experience if people want it, but it's got the flexibility to sync things locally as well and all sorts. It'll be something that you can build in. It can be a platform where you'll build line of business apps in alongside those teams of files and data. And that carrot part, if people are bought into that vision of Microsoft 365, then that's the thing, they can hang their hat on and say, this is why we went this way instead of going to another tool that's going to sit alongside it. Because if they just went purely to OneDrive and SharePoint and didn't do the Teams bit, then where's the benefit, right? They could just add Box as a tab integration or whatever into a team. So thinking about, what the experience is going to be like. We also then need to go a little bit further down and understand where the data lives, who owns this data, whether it's going to be our responsibility as IT, as a project team, to manage what will go where and when, and what won't go to the cloud, what might go somewhere else, what might go to archives, what might go to Azure files, and what we should expect in terms of working with those data owners. Are they going to have time to look at their data and reorganize it if necessary as well? Because if you've got those expectations right at the beginning, then you can have a realistic timeline for when you're actually going to be ready to migrate. Because that's one thing that people can never get it perfectly right unless you know the business quite well. You know that what to expect in terms of engagement and what control you've got as well. So on the other side, how are we going to use things? Are we going to drive people directly into Teams? Or are we going to give them options for ways that they can access this? And that might be down to the way that you're trying to drive usage. So if you had no Teams usage today, unlikely, if you're here, right? But if you've got no Teams usage today, then having that as the front door makes a lot more sense, because then you've got something that people have to go to Teams for. But you might have a more common scenario where actually you want people to use the right tool for them. So people might use the files cached locally when they're traveling, if they're traveling. And some people might just prefer to be able to go into Windows Explorer and get access to the same stuff, whereas the people that they're working with, some of those people might prefer to go into Teams and work on the data. So thinking about what you're going to plan in terms of those use cases might come from some of the user research, might come from that business planning, the technology change planning that you've got in terms of what your end destination is going to look like. And often you won't want to bring everything across. And that can be one of the harder things to make a decision about, because the thing I learned as a Exchange and UC person joining a company full of SharePoint experts was not only that, whoa, there's a lot of different things you can learn about SharePoint and specializations in it, but when it comes to moving data across, there's always this cut of what you're going to bring with you, and it's very rarely everything. There'll be common themes of like 70-30 in terms of what will be old data that will be inappropriate to bring across, and data that's going to be useful or active data that you're going to bring across to the other side. And SharePoint is not free for large volumes of data either. So bringing tons and tons of stuff across, it's going to be costly, and it's going to continue to grow and be more costly. And if you've worked with Office 365 customers for a long time, then one thing that you might hear on a regular basis is our SharePoint storage costs are growing out of control. What can we do about this? And once you're in that situation, it's harder to sort of row back from that unless you start layering on other solutions that can move the data out. And you probably don't want to do that because you moved all your old stuff that nobody accesses in. So there's other places you can move data to. Azure files being one case if it's going to the cloud. There's a lot of options in Azure for long-term storage of archive data that can be accessed either via PCs, Macs, whatever is going to access that via traditional SMB file shares, or other solutions layered on top as well. A common place is things like Azure files. Rarely, if they're on things like NetApp, their NetApp file is in the cloud as well as a place to move that older data to. So understanding who manages that data, and that user experience. So the end point that we do want is a better user experience. And the biggest challenge over the years with moving files into Office 365 has always been disappointment if you don't do this part right. I was chatting to an old colleague, and we were talking about a project in about 2013 when we moved a small organization over to SharePoint Online. And they were so disappointed. At TechEd 2014, there was a queue of people at a OneDrive presentation, and they were very upset about the OneDrive Sync client back then. As you know, things have improved a lot with that, and it's not always perfect. So, yes. Yeah. What? Sorry.
Just wanted to know which criteria you use today to define if the data should be moved. Do you use the last date or last modification date?
It depends.
You speak about the 30-70%.
It depends on the client and what the requirements are. In essence, though, using tools to assess either tools from vendors or free tooling that is looking at the size of folders and the data of folders. So tree size type tree size utilities that map that data out. But the criteria on the age of the data and the type of data to move does depend on what the retention requirements are going to be for that data in terms of what they'll need to be able to access. And if there's a strategy that things will also need to have information protection on as well on the other side. So.
But do you apply the retention before moving? Because it could already clean a lot of things.
It depends. It depends. It depends on the strategy and the timeline and how long it's going to take. So some customers will go, first of all, to using the AOP scanner to classify data first, because they'll be planning to keep a lot of data either on-prem or move it somewhere else where it's traditional files, and they'll do that part first. Others will be looking to then do this on the other side and then just move things to long-term storage, but not use any on-premises classification. There's probably 90% of customers doing that kind of move, maybe more actually. Maybe 90% of the ones that are also going to do the whole MIP thing will move first. But it will be a mix of business units that you can engage with where they can tell us what's important. Because when something was last accessed doesn't always mean that that's not important to them, because there's going to be things that they will access or just want there in case they need to access it. For example, a folder with 10 years of spreadsheets done once a year or end of quarter. They want to see all of those. They want to see it cut in the middle, and it'll be a small volume of data. It'll be 100 meg maximum. So that would be the type of data that you'd move over. And this is why who owns that data is quite important, and whether we can expect engagement from them as we do it. Because if we don't have any engagement, then we're down to a point where we must go on a criteria that we, as a project team,
you have to decide. Yes.
The ideal would obviously be
but
that they tell us what they want, and even move things to the right place in a structure for moving. But I don't know over time that's happened with a client for us.
And what is your strategy? So do you say to the business owners, the data business owners, if you don't answer to me, let's say in 1 month, by default it will be not moved. And if you will answer to me, we can move them.
That's a starting point.
Okay.
But
you do the aggressive, let's say, version, or you do a smooth version? Like, if you don't say anything, I will move them just in case.
It's a starting point, and I think most customers will start with that. We're going to do this notification, emails out, customized, saying this is going to happen. We found these things, and
what do you want to do?
If they don't respond at all, then chasing them up several times. But it's rare that somebody will then go, well, they've not responded, let's just do it. Because if you're thinking of hundreds of people that haven't responded, then this is where we also people start worrying about HR issues as well. Is somebody on maternity leave, or have they been suspended from the other aspects where HR would not want us to touch their data, even though they are just on maternity leave or sabbatical, and it's shared data that should be moved. So that will depend on customers though, where they've got a risk averse attitude or a JFDI attitude, where they we're going to do it, we're going to tell people, and they do it. I prefer the former because it's better to ask for forgiveness in many cases and take some responsibility on it. But I can absolutely understand why you wouldn't, because I've been in the same situation where I've checked with HR when I've been on the customer side and they've said, don't touch that person's data. So they're only on maternity leave. Well, they might, there might be a question about their return. We don't know, so don't touch anything. So we just move it as is. So I hate to say it depends, but I am a consultant. But hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
In several ways? Yeah, cool. The fundamental thing is, though, we do want to improve what's there at the other side. So getting these bits right is key, primarily for that, right? Because if we don't, we're in a bad position. That's the most fundamental thing. And most of these projects, you need to show people the right ways of working once we reach the other side. Now, the other part of that, though, is you've probably got Teams usage already. And what we will see with most customers is either they've followed Microsoft guidance, and it's good guidance that Karana and others have been promoting over the last few years, which is let people do what they want. Open the thing up. Or maybe if you don't do that, at least put a life cycle on it. Use the Microsoft 365 group life cycle management to allow the right people to create things, use templates. And that means that you might actually, when you're thinking about bringing files across, have some questions that you've got to ask yourself, because you're going to have perhaps the teams already there for a lot of people, but they might not match their group file shares or the substructures within them that you would envisage moving things across to. There might be now a split, or they might have actually started moving some of their files themselves, depending on the way that they've learnt about Teams. One thing that surprised me is if you look on some of the YouTube videos, I think there's a chap, Mark Thompson, who did a session yesterday. You look at his YouTube channel, user focused videos on Microsoft 365 Teams. Tens of thousands of views on these videos. People have been looking for guidance themselves on how to do things right in Teams. So you might have to fit in with what people have done, or go back and clean up on the other side. You've got to rebuild that structure for what it's going to be, but you haven't got free rein unless you're starting again. But I am not a SharePoint information architecture expert. But it is important to understand those key concepts. So I'm going to talk about what that is very briefly, so you've got a good understanding of what you need to really think about and consider, and why. So if you're not a SharePoint expert, then this will be useful. If you're a die-in-the-wall SharePoint architect in the room, then you're free to tell me where I'm wrong, because I've got an interpretation of this, and it's not entirely the same as my colleagues who are SharePoint architects, because I'm looking at this from managing file servers in the past, Teams, I'm trying to look at the bigger picture really, not just thinking of it from a records management and metadata point of view, because no one likes metadata all over the place. SharePoint file usage has exploded because of Teams and the simplicity it brings. But we do need to have some rules for organizing things, because people need to be able to find stuff. It needs to be linked together somehow. And we need to be able to make it easy for people to go and put places in the right place, so they don't just make it up as they go along. So outside of Teams, we've got a lot of core fundamental concepts that build this out. So you've got the intranet side of stuff. That's more relevant than it used to be to Teams with Viva connections. But the way that those sites are structured for public information where people are uploading policies and procedures. They might be putting those in Teams files with the expectation that they'll be surfaced on an intranet for people to then go and access with a navigation structure that then actually might be aligned to the Microsoft 365 groups and the teams that people are in. You don't want to have a duplicate of that for no good reason. And then you've got people's team sites where they're going to leverage some of these features, hopefully, not just use files. So again, making sure that that all works together is important. And where we've got the files that are coming in, then there's going to be a portal that people are going to come to. Now, that's not necessarily going to be the team just enlightened for people to use, but we might want to have some links to that. And one thing that's changed massively about SharePoint, and then aligns it very much to Teams, is modern SharePoint, where it's a lot better than it used to be. No longer can we go, it's just a website. It works well, and it's a good platform to build upon. And there's some glue that is useful to understand when you're thinking about your team structure, and then how that might relate in the future. So the way that you build SharePoint out now is you don't build subsites inside it and then document libraries. And often you won't really want to build lots of document libraries inside SharePoint sites if you're going to use it with Teams, because it doesn't use that same concept. But you will want to be able to link things together, and you can use hub sites to do that so that it brings together these sites. So you might have the communication site, you might have that HR portal that people can go to, and part of that is going to be the one that's attached to the team, where actually, the Teams users are going to see that in there. And that means that if you try and do this afterwards, after you've migrated your files or after you've adopted Teams, then you're not going to have a great time. The downside of this is going to be that you're going to build out a completely separate structure, or as what we're seeing is people have built out a SharePoint structure that matched their on-premises site collection format, and now they're in a position where they're adopting Teams, or they want to migrate file shares in, and because they just did their SharePoint migration, the SharePoint team had tunnel vision, then they'd built out subsites, they'd used the old ways of working and not thought about this newer model. So try and tie it together. If you've done this already, you're not one of the largest organizations in the world. Did separate project teams, all doing the same, all doing different things, a SharePoint one, a file one, a Teams one, a Slack project as well, all different work streams, completely not linked together. And myself and some chaps at Modality, we all went in, we could not convince them otherwise. So I'll finish off by talking about the options for moving in. And you've got Migration Manager and the SharePoint Migration Tool. Those are two good tools. Migration Manager is probably your go-to as a starting point. The SharePoint Migration Tool is good as well if you've got SharePoint on-prem. Both have got Teams migration capabilities built in. Now, the Teams migration capabilities are SharePoint file migration capabilities. The benefit that they give you over and above thinking purely about SharePoint is when you've built out your team structure that you're going to migrate into, they give you the ability to see the channels that you're going to move into, and then migrate data into the folder structure that sits underneath that document library. Now, that is effectively the same as just picking the folder in the picker, but it means that you're actually aligning what you're doing to the teams that are there. So it makes it easier, especially if you're just using this as a tool out of the box. You've got third-party tools as well, good tools on the market. There's not a bad tool out there that I'm aware of. They're all pretty great. Most of them on-prem tools, so you've got to build out servers. But even with Migration Manager, you've got to have a server to run the agents on. You've got to install an agent, or one or more. Common to all of these, you want to make sure there's low latency between the agents and the file server, good connectivity up to the cloud, and there's common guidance on migration speeds as well. So you're not going to migrate 10 terabytes a day, but you'll see, based on the average file size, what you might expect. Rough order of magnitude across everything might be a top end of 400 to 500 gig a day. You might never hit the top end, but lots of small files will take longer. A folder with loads of ISOs in, for example, if you're going to move that to SharePoint Online, would be faster. Big files streaming as it moves across, easier to migrate. But the migration speeds should be relatively the same from tool to tool because they're all using the same Microsoft APIs. Fast Track can help as well, but Fast Track is a way of bringing you in to use those tools. They're moving to a self-service model, which for Exchange means the way we always used to migrate it, and for SharePoint means that's why they built Migration Manager. They built a self-service tool for doing the migration for you.
We only have about a couple minutes left.
Yep. So any questions before we go and wrap up? Because I've got some extra supporting slides for the end of this, but I've got a couple more slides before we finish.
Right back there. If you could grab the little mic thing, great.
Just on surfacing the files that you've migrated, the OneDrive Sync client takes it straight into Explorer, which is a really good experience for the clients, for the end user, and they're used to that.
Yeah.
Putting them into Teams, it's not so easy to search. You can't just type in the first 3 letters of the file and it'll take you down the list. Is that going to improve, or are people generally just surfacing them in through the Sync client?
Yes, to both of that. So it's going to improve. If we went back to what Microsoft suggested a couple of years ago for Microsoft Search, you'll have seen by now it's completely better. But I think their priorities have changed in what was important. I think Ilya, the other chap on the keynote, I saw something he tweeted about why Microsoft haven't been able to deliver everything on the roadmap. A lot, the situation with COVID in India earlier in the year caused them a lot of problems. And when you think about it that way, knocking Microsoft for not delivering stuff is more understandable. And they changed the priorities completely to focus on Zoom Compete, basically, from what I can tell. So it should have improved. It hasn't yet. But the expectation is that if you go to, say, the Office homepage or Microsoft Search, and you find that the search works very well there, but not so well in Teams, the expectation should have been by now that it works really well in Teams, and more SharePoint-focused capabilities have lit up over the last couple of years, but more are expected as well. So we can now do better sorting. We can click buttons to sync to OneDrive and so on. But it is a matter of preference. It's going to depend on the number and type of files in there and the way of accessing it, people's preferences, how they're accessing and where. So, for example, if I'm using my home PC, bring your own device, I go in through the Microsoft Cloud App Security session proxy. So I'm web only. I can't download or use the file in an app. So I'll go in through Teams to access my stuff. But when I'm on my work laptop, I use a really good new feature inside SharePoint. If you've not seen it, you open up the SharePoint site and you press Add to OneDrive, and it puts a link inside OneDrive. You don't even have to sync the site, and that works so well. It works really, really well. So it's down to how you want people to use it, the type of files that are in there. But Teams it's a different way of working and accessing the files, and people might not prefer it, as you say. So I think really you have to give people that option. Otherwise, then you've got resistance that you need to then overcome, and you've got to build out reasons for why this is better. And unless you've got evidence to support that, where you can actually tell them a story and they go, well, yeah, exactly, that's my problem today, then it's just going to be an uphill struggle. As you say, they're going to say, I could just search for it, and now I can't. Why can't I just have some sort of sync locally? No, we decided to block that.
So unfortunately, we are at our limit for time. So if we could give a round of applause for a great presentation.